His wife found him on the bathroom floor. His eyes were open, but he couldn't speak. Just 5 minutes earlier, he had put clove oil under his tongue. Now his body was losing control. His blood sugar was crashing. His consciousness was fading. And within minutes, doctors were fighting to keep him alive. But the strangest part wasn't what was happening. It was what had happened 5 minutes earlier. Because the only thing he had done differently that morning was put clove oil under his tongue. This is Hidden Pathogens.
This is Hidden Pathogens?
He was 42, lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, with his wife Sophia, and worked as a sales manager for a medical equipment company. Theodore was generally health conscious. He exercised regularly, rarely drank, and preferred simple remedies over doctor visits. Sophia was different. She was a nurse, so she was usually the cautious one. If Theodore mentioned a strange symptom, she was the person who asked questions, checked his temperature, and decided whether it actually needed medical attention. That morning, Theodore woke up complaining that his mouth felt like it was burning. His throat felt scratchy too. Sophia looked at him and wasn't particularly worried. "Drink some water," she told him. "It'll probably settle down." But Theodore had another idea. On the kitchen counter was a small bottle of clove oil. He had recently started experimenting with natural remedies, and he believed the oil might soothe the irritation. Sophia saw him reach for the bottle. She hesitated for a moment. Then she let it go. To her, it was just another one of Theodore's harmless home remedies. She had no reason to believe she would soon remember that moment over and over again. Because only minutes later, Theodore would be lying on their bathroom floor. And Sophia, the nurse who had initially told him not to worry, would be the one desperately trying to figure out what was happening to her husband. What she dismissed that morning would soon become the most important clue in the entire case. But what was happening inside Theodore's body during those first 5 minutes? At first, Theodore felt nothing unusual. He stood at the kitchen counter, rinsing his mouth with water. Sophia had already turned away, thinking the moment was over. Then Theodore swallowed. He paused. Something felt different. Not painful. Not yet. Just strange. His tongue felt slightly numb. Theodore rubbed it against the roof of his mouth, trying to figure out whether the sensation was coming from the clove oil or from the irritation he'd already been feeling. "That's weird," he muttered. Sophia looked back. "What?" "My tongue." She walked over and watched him speak. His words sounded normal. His face looked normal. His breathing was normal. So Sophia wasn't alarmed. "Give it a few minutes," she said. Theodore nodded. He reached for his coffee. But as he lifted the cup, he noticed something else. His hand wasn't quite as steady as it usually was. He set the cup back down. Sophia noticed. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he smiled. But this time, Sophia didn't smile back. She had seen enough patients to know that small changes could sometimes be the first sign that something bigger was coming. Still, there was nothing obvious to explain. No rash, no swelling. No difficulty breathing, no loss of consciousness, just a strange numbness and a barely noticeable change in his coordination. So Sophia watched him carefully. For the next few minutes, Theodore seemed fine. Then he reached for his phone. He stared at the screen for a moment. Sophia noticed the pause. "What are you looking for?" Theodore looked up. He seemed slightly confused. "I don't know." It lasted only a second. Then he picked up the phone and smiled. "Never mind." Sophia nodded. She tried to dismiss it. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe the morning had simply started badly. But as Theodore walked toward the bathroom, he stopped in the hallway. He looked back at Sophia. There was something different in his expression now. Not fear, not pain, just uncertainty. And then he quietly asked, "Sophia, did I already tell you my tongue feels numb?" Here's what's happening inside Theodore's body. From the outside, Theodore still looked almost completely normal. Inside his body, however, the clove oil was no longer sitting where he had placed it. Some of its compounds were being absorbed through the tissues of his mouth and entering his circulation. One of those compounds was eugenol. As eugenol moved through Theodore's bloodstream, it began reaching tissues throughout his body, including his nervous system. That was when the strange sensations began to make more sense. The numbness in Theodore's tongue wasn't necessarily the first thing happening. It was simply the first thing he could feel. As the eugenol reached his nervous system, it began altering the signals that helped his brain and body communicate. At first, the changes were subtle. His hand wasn't quite as steady. His thoughts briefly slipped away. A simple question took him longer to answer. And then there were those moments when Theodore seemed to lose track of what he had just been doing. His body was still compensating. His heart was still beating. His lungs were still moving air. He could still stand and walk. That was why Sophia had no reason to believe she was watching the beginning of a medical emergency. But Theodore's body was already struggling to maintain its normal balance. As more of the compound circulated, the effects were no longer limited to the place where the oil had been applied. Something that had started in his mouth was becoming a problem throughout his body. Theodore didn't know any of this. Sophia didn't know it either. All she could see was her husband standing in the hallway, looking confused for a moment before trying to brush it off. But beneath that ordinary-looking surface, the substance he had deliberately placed under his tongue was continuing to move through his body. And the symptoms that seemed minor only minutes earlier were beginning to change. But what would happen when Theodore's body could no longer compensate? Theodore made it halfway down the hallway before stopping again. Sophia watched him. "Theodore?" He didn't answer. His right hand was resting against the wall. At first, she thought he was simply steadying himself. Then she noticed his breathing. It was faster than before. "Theodore, are you okay?" He turned toward her. "I think so." But his voice sounded different, quieter, less certain. Sophia walked closer. "What are you feeling?" Theodore opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out. He seemed to search for the words. Then, finally, "I feel strange." Sophia's expression changed. "Sit down. I can walk." "I know. Just sit down." He lowered himself onto the edge of the couch. For a few seconds, he looked completely normal again. Then his head dipped forward. Sophia reached for his shoulder. "Theodore?" He looked up. His eyes seemed unfocused. "What's wrong?" she asked. He stared at her, then at the room around him. "I don't know." That answer frightened her more than the numbness had. Sophia checked his breathing. She watched his face. She asked him simple questions. His name, where they were, what day it was. Theodore answered the first two. Then he hesitated. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Sophia's training took over. Whatever this was, it was no longer something they could simply wait out. She reached for her phone. But before she could make the call, Theodore suddenly grabbed the edge of the couch. His fingers tightened. His muscles suddenly tightened. Sophia froze. "Theodore?" His eyes remained open, but he wasn't responding to her anymore. Then his body jerked once. Sophia dropped her phone onto the floor. What was happening to Theodore? And why was his condition deteriorating so quickly? Sophia reached for her phone. "Theodore?" He didn't answer. She moved closer. "Theodore, look at me." His eyes shifted toward her, but his expression was distant. Then his knees suddenly buckled. Sophia caught his shoulder, but his weight pulled them both toward the floor. "Theodore!" He collapsed onto his side. Sophia immediately checked his breathing. He was breathing, but he wasn't responding. "Theodore, can you hear me?" Nothing. She tapped his shoulder. Nothing. Then his muscles tightened again. Sophia turned him carefully onto his side and moved anything nearby that could hurt him. Her hands were steady. Her voice wasn't. "Come on, Theodore. Stay with me." She grabbed her phone and called 911. "My husband collapsed," she told the dispatcher. "He's breathing, but he's not responding normally." The dispatcher began asking questions. How old was he? Had he fallen? Was he breathing normally? Was he taking any medications? Sophia answered as quickly as she could. Then the dispatcher asked the question that made her pause. Does he have any known medical conditions? Sophia looked down at Theodore. No. At least, not anything that could explain this. She looked toward the kitchen. The bottle of clove oil was still sitting on the counter. For a moment, she stared at it. Then she looked back at Theodore. She remembered his numb tongue, the confusion, the strange question in the hallway, and now this. Sophia picked up the bottle. She didn't know whether it mattered. She didn't even know whether to tell the dispatcher about it, but something about the timing suddenly bothered her. She read the label quickly. Then she heard the dispatcher say, "Ma'am, stay on the line." Sophia put the bottle down and rushed back to her husband. Minutes later, the sound of sirens approached their house. But when the paramedics arrived, one of the first things they noticed didn't look like a seizure at all. Why had a seemingly healthy man suddenly collapsed? And what was the clove oil doing in the middle of it? The paramedics entered the house and immediately went to Theodore. Sophia stepped aside as they knelt beside him. One paramedic checked his airway. Another attached a pulse oximeter to his finger. "Can you hear me?" Theodore's eyes opened, but he still wasn't answering normally. "What's his name?" the paramedic asked. "Theodore Stallone. He's 42. Any medical history?" "Nothing like this." The paramedic checked his pupils and watched his breathing. His oxygen saturation was normal. His heart rate was elevated, but his pulse was steady. Then they checked his blood glucose. The reading was normal. Severe hypoglycemia was unlikely to explain what they were seeing, but Theodore still wasn't acting like himself. He was confused. He couldn't clearly explain what had happened, and when the paramedic asked Sophia what she had seen before he collapsed, she described the brief stiffening and jerking. The paramedic looked at his partner. "How long was he unresponsive?" "Less than a minute," Sophia said. That detail changed the picture. A sudden collapse followed by abnormal movements and confusion afterward could fit a seizure. It wasn't proof, but in that moment, it was one of the most plausible explanations. Sophia felt a strange sense of relief. A seizure was frightening, but at least it was something she could understand. Then the paramedic asked, "Did he hit his head?" "No." "Any recreational drugs? Alcohol? New medications?" "No." Sophia hesitated. Then she remembered the bottle on the kitchen counter. There was clove oil. The paramedic looked toward the kitchen. "How much did he use?" Sophia shook her head. "I don't know." The paramedic picked up the bottle and examined the label. But nothing on it immediately explained why Theodore had collapsed. So, for now, the paramedics treated the episode as a possible seizure and prepared him for transport. Sophia climbed into the ambulance beside him. As the doors closed, Theodore opened his eyes again. For a moment, she thought he was finally coming back to himself. Then he whispered something she could barely hear. "I'm so tired." His eyes closed again. Sophia reached for his hand. She had spent years watching patients become sick for reasons that eventually made sense. But this didn't make sense. His oxygen was stable, his blood sugar was normal, and yet his brain was behaving as though something was seriously wrong. If this really was a seizure, what was causing a seemingly healthy man to suddenly have one? By the time Theodore reached the emergency department, he was awake again. But he wasn't himself. He knew Sophia's name. He knew he was in a hospital. But his answers were slow, and every few minutes, he seemed to lose track of the conversation. Doctors moved quickly. An IV was started. Blood was drawn. A heart monitor was attached, and another neurological assessment began. At first, the seizure theory still seemed reasonable. Theodore had collapsed, his muscles had tightened, his body had jerked, and afterward, he had been confused. But then the first laboratory results came back. The doctor stared at the blood gas results. His blood pH was falling, and his bicarbonate level was lower than it should have been. Something was disturbing Theodore's acid-base balance. The doctors looked at each other. A metabolic disturbance could explain some of his confusion, but it didn't explain everything. They checked his blood glucose again. Still normal. They checked his oxygen level. Still stable. There was no obvious head injury. No known recreational drug use. No new prescription medication. And no history of seizures. The working theory was beginning to weaken. Instead of asking only, what caused Theodore to collapse? The doctors now had another question. What was causing his body chemistry to change so rapidly? Sophia stood beside the bed as another doctor reviewed the results. Then someone asked her to go through the morning again, from the beginning. What had Theodore eaten? What had he taken? What had he touched? Had he been sick? Had anything been different? Sophia thought about the kitchen, then the bathroom, then the bottle sitting on the counter. The clove oil, she said. The doctor looked up. What about it? He used it under his tongue. How much? Sophia hesitated. I don't know. The doctor asked to see the bottle. Sophia handed it over. He read the label carefully. Then he looked back at Theodore. For several seconds, he said nothing. Because the timing was beginning to bother him. The symptoms had started shortly after the exposure. Now Theodore's nervous system was deteriorating, and his blood chemistry was changing. But the doctors still didn't know whether the bottle in Sophia's hand was the answer or simply another coincidence. So what could possibly connect the strange neurological symptoms, the worsening acid-base imbalance, and a bottle of clove oil? The doctor looked at the bottle again. Then he looked at Theodore. Clove oil contains eugenol, he said. Sophia stared at him. What does that mean? It can be toxic when the exposure is significant enough. The doctor turned back toward the monitor. Suddenly, the pieces were beginning to fit. The strange numbness in Theodore's mouth, the confusion, the loss of coordination, the collapse, the abnormal movements, and now the worsening disturbance in his blood chemistry. They weren't necessarily separate problems. They could all be manifestations of the same toxic exposure. The doctor explained that eugenol, the major active compound in clove oil, can be absorbed into the body and, in significant toxic exposures, affect the central nervous system. That could help explain why Theodore's behavior had changed before he collapsed. And as the toxicity progressed, in severe poisoning, eugenol can affect the central nervous system and contribute to systemic metabolic disturbances, including metabolic acidosis, reflected in his falling blood pH and low bicarbonate. The seizure theory suddenly looked different. The episode may not have been a primary seizure disorder at all. It could have been the brain reacting to a rapidly developing toxic and metabolic disturbance. Sophia looked at Theodore. So the clove oil caused this? The doctor paused. If the exposure was significant enough, it could. That distinction mattered. They weren't claiming that every use of clove oil was dangerous. They were trying to determine whether Theodore had received enough concentrated eugenol to produce poisoning. And now they had a direction. The team ordered additional testing and began treating the abnormalities they could identify while monitoring his neurological status closely. Sophia stood beside the bed, staring at the bottle she had watched Theodore pick up that morning. She remembered what she had said. Give it a few minutes. She had thought the numbness was nothing. Now she realized that it may have been the first warning. The diagnosis finally had a name: acute eugenol toxicity from clove oil exposure. But knowing what was poisoning Theodore was only the beginning. If the toxin had already reached his nervous system and disrupted his blood chemistry, what would it do next? Before we continue, if you're fascinated by real medical mysteries like this, share this video and subscribe to this channel. And if you value these videos, there's a free link in the description and pinned comment that helps support the channel. Even if you've clicked it before, endeavor to click on it again with every new video you watch from this channel. Every bit of click helps us continue researching and telling these stories, and it's completely free. Now, let's continue. The diagnosis had finally been made, but Theodore wasn't getting better. Within the next hour, his confusion deepened. He stopped answering questions consistently. Sophia leaned over the bed. "Theodore, can you hear me?" His eyes opened, but they didn't seem to focus on her. A nurse checked his vital signs again. His breathing had become noticeably slower and shallower. The team moved closer. "Let's get another blood gas." The result came back. His pH was still low and his bicarbonate remained low. The metabolic acidosis had not corrected, and Theodore's neurological status was getting worse. The team continued supportive treatment and monitored his heart rhythm, oxygen level, blood pressure, glucose, kidney function, and liver function closely. But the toxin's effects were continuing. Theodore became increasingly difficult to wake. Sophia watched as the doctor tried to rouse him. "Theodore, open your eyes." Nothing. The doctor tried again. This time, Theodore's eyes opened briefly, but he couldn't follow the command. His breathing became even more shallow. Sophia looked at the monitor. "Is he getting enough oxygen?" "His oxygen saturation is still acceptable," the doctor said. But that wasn't the only concern. A patient could have an acceptable oxygen saturation and still be breathing inadequately, especially as consciousness deteriorated. The doctor looked at Theodore's latest blood gas, then at his breathing, then at Sophia. The decision suddenly became urgent. If Theodore became too unconscious to protect his airway, he could aspirate. If his breathing weakened further, he might not be able to maintain adequate ventilation. But intubation itself carried risks. They couldn't wait until he stopped breathing. The team prepared the airway equipment. Sophia stood beside the bed, watching them move around her husband. Then Theodore suddenly opened his eyes. For one brief moment, he looked directly at her. She reached for his hand. "Theodore?" His lips moved. "Sophia." It was barely a whisper. Then his eyes closed again. The doctor checked his response. Nothing. He looked at the respiratory therapist, then back at Theodore. The room went quiet. The question was no longer whether Theodore was sick. It was whether he could keep breathing safely on his own. Did they have enough time to wait? Or did Theodore need to be intubated before his airway became impossible to protect? The doctor looked at Theodore's latest blood gas one more time. Then he looked at Theodore. His breathing was shallow, his eyes barely open to stimulation, and he was no longer reliably protecting his airway. The decision was made. "We're going to intubate." Sophia felt her stomach drop. Now. The team moved immediately. A respiratory therapist brought the airway equipment closer. A nurse prepared the medications. Another clinician positioned Theodore carefully. Sophia stepped back as the room suddenly filled with movement. She had watched intubations before. She had seen patients connected to ventilators, but this was different. This was her husband. The medications were given. Within seconds, Theodore became deeply unresponsive. The doctor placed the breathing tube and confirmed its position. The ventilator began delivering supported breaths. Sophia watched Theodore's chest rise and fall with the machine. A nurse secured the tube. The monitor continued to beep. Sophia covered her mouth. "He's going to be okay, right?" The doctor paused. "We're giving him the support he needs, while his body clears the toxin." Sophia looked at the ventilator, then at Theodore. Then at the bottle of clove oil sitting inside a plastic evidence bag. A few hours earlier, it had looked harmless. Now it had become the center of an emergency that had placed her husband on mechanical ventilation. But the airway was only the first problem. The team drew another arterial blood sample. They needed to know whether Theodore's ventilation and metabolic disturbance were improving. The result came back. His pH was still low, and his bicarbonate remained low. The acidosis had not disappeared. The doctors adjusted his ventilator support while continuing to treat the underlying toxic exposure. Then they looked at his blood pressure. It was lower than before, not yet catastrophic, but enough to make the team watch it closely. They continued checking his heart rhythm and circulation, watching for any sign that the toxicity was beginning to affect his cardiovascular system. Then came the organs. His creatinine and urine output were checked repeatedly to make sure his kidneys were still functioning. His AST and ALT were being followed because severe toxic exposure can injure the liver. For now, there was no evidence of catastrophic organ failure. But that didn't mean Theodore was safe. The numbers could change, and the team knew it. Sophia stood beside the bed, watching the monitors. The ventilator was supporting every breath. The IV lines were delivering medication and fluids. The monitors were tracking his heart, blood pressure, and oxygen level. And yet the toxin was still inside him. She reached through the rail and took his hand. "You're not allowed to leave me," she whispered. Theodore didn't respond. The only answer was the steady rhythm of the ventilator. The team ordered another set of labs, another blood gas, another check of his kidney and liver function. Now they had to wait. Not for a medication to instantly reverse the poisoning, but for Theodore's body to begin clearing what had already entered it. And if his blood pressure fell, his acidosis worsened, or his kidneys and liver began to fail, how much more could Theodore's body take? The next few hours passed slowly. Sophia barely left Theodore's side. The ventilator continued its steady rhythm. Every few minutes, she looked at the monitor. Then the team returned with another blood sample. They needed to know whether Theodore's body was finally turning the corner. The arterial blood gas came back first. The doctor studied the numbers. His pH had improved. His bicarbonate was beginning to rise. The metabolic acidosis wasn't completely gone, but it was no longer worsening. Sophia noticed the change in his expression. "Is that good?" The doctor nodded. "It's encouraging," but they weren't ready to celebrate. His blood pressure was still being watched closely. It had fallen earlier, but now it was holding more steadily, without escalating circulatory support. Then they checked his urine output. For hours, the nurses had been measuring every drop. Now there was more urine collecting in the catheter bag. His kidneys were still producing urine. That was another encouraging sign. Then came the creatinine. It had not risen significantly, and his urine output remained steady. There was no clear evidence that an acute kidney injury was developing. Sophia exhaled, but the doctor wasn't finished. He looked at the liver tests. The room became quiet again. His AST and ALT had risen mildly, not dramatically, not enough to suggest catastrophic liver failure, but they were higher than before. The exposure had left a measurable effect on his liver. Sophia looked at the doctor. "Is his liver damaged?" "There's some evidence of liver stress," he said. "We'll have to keep watching it." That was the answer Sophia hadn't wanted, but the numbers weren't showing an unstoppable collapse. The team continued supportive care and repeated the laboratory tests. Hours passed. Then another blood gas came back. The pH had moved closer to normal. The bicarbonate had continued to recover. His blood pressure remained stable. His urine output continued. His creatinine still hadn't risen significantly. And even the liver enzymes had stopped climbing. For the first time since Theodore had collapsed, the trend was changing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the right direction. Sophia reached through the bed rail and squeezed his hand. Theodore was still unconscious, still connected to the ventilator, still critically ill. But his body was finally beginning to clear the toxin. Then, almost imperceptibly, his fingers moved. Sophia froze. She looked at his hand. "Theodore?" Nothing. She waited. Then his fingers moved again. The nurse noticed too. The doctor stepped closer. "Let's see if he can respond." Sophia held her breath. After everything that had happened, the first real sign of recovery wasn't a dramatic awakening. It was a tiny movement of his hand, but it was enough to tell them something important. Theodore's body was finally beginning to fight its way back. But when would he wake up? And would he remember what had happened after the clove oil changed everything? The next morning, Sophia was still sitting beside Theodore. The ventilator continued its steady rhythm, but something had changed. Theodore's fingers moved again. This time, Sophia saw it immediately. "Theodore?" His eyelids fluttered, then opened. For a few seconds, he stared at the ceiling, confused, disoriented. Alive, Sophia leaned closer. Can you hear me? His eyes moved toward her. He blinked once, then again. Sophia covered her mouth. The doctor was called into the room. The neurological assessment began immediately. Could Theodore follow a simple command? He squeezed the doctor's fingers. Could he move both arms? He did. Could he move his legs? He did that too. His responses were slow, but they were purposeful. That mattered. Now came the next question. Could Theodore breathe safely without the ventilator? The team gradually reduced the ventilator support while watching him closely. His oxygen saturation remained stable. His breathing became stronger. His blood pressure held steady. Another blood gas showed that the metabolic acidosis had continued to improve. His pH was moving toward normal. His bicarbonate was recovering. His creatinine had remained stable, and his urine output was still adequate. His AST and ALT had stopped rising. The team watched him through a spontaneous breathing trial. Minutes passed, then more. Theodore remained awake enough to follow commands. His breathing was strong and regular. He was maintaining adequate oxygenation without increasing support. The respiratory therapist looked at the doctor. He's ready. The doctor nodded. They were ready to remove the tube. Sophia stood beside the bed. The breathing tube came out. Theodore coughed, then took a deep breath. Another. For the first time since the crisis began, he was breathing completely on his own. Sophia grabbed his hand. Theodore looked at her. His voice was barely audible. What happened? Sophia stared at him. She had imagined this moment for hours. She had imagined being angry, relieved, terrified. But now that he was awake, all she could do was cry. You scared me. Theodore looked confused. I don't remember. Sophia looked toward the plastic evidence bag containing the bottle of clove oil, then back at him. You put that under your tongue. Theodore's expression changed. Slowly, pieces began coming back. The numbness, the strange feeling. Sophia asking if he was okay, then nothing. Sophia squeezed his hand. You almost died. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The doctors continued monitoring him over the following days. His neurological function continued improving. His metabolic acidosis resolved. His kidney function remained stable. The mild elevation in his liver enzymes began trending downward. He was eventually able to eat, drink, walk, and hold a normal conversation again. There was no dramatic final complication, no hidden disease, no permanent neurological catastrophe. He had simply survived a severe toxic exposure. Before Theodore left the hospital, the doctor spoke to both of them. The lesson wasn't that clove oil was inherently dangerous every time someone encountered it. The problem was concentrated exposure and the assumption that something labeled natural could not cause harm. Sophia understood that now. A few days later, she stood in their kitchen. The bottle was still there, the same bottle Theodore had picked up that morning. She looked at it for several seconds, then she threw it away. Theodore watched from the doorway. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. 5 minutes earlier, it had been just another bottle in their home. 5 minutes later, Theodore's body had begun to change, and what Sophia would remember most wasn't the bottle. It was the sound of the ventilator beside the man she loved. Because something that looked harmless had nearly taken him away. Theodore survived acute eugenol toxicity. And the next time he saw the word natural, he knew exactly what it did and did not mean. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These stories take a lot of research to put together. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a free link in the description and pinned comment. Checking it out helps support future videos. Even if you've clicked it before, endeavor to click on it again on every new video you watch from this channel. Every click allows us to keep bringing these cases to the channel. And it's completely free. If you learned something from this case, like, share, and subscribe for more real medical stories. And if you chose not to subscribe, drop a comment and tell me what would make these videos better or what you learned from it. I read far more comments than you might think. This is Hidden Pathogens, I'll see you in the next diagnosis. Good night.
This is hidden pathogens?